Okay, so caring for our own. Basically, the whole issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide, we recognize is legal in Canada. So, the question is how do we deal with this question now that this has been legal and this affects all of us? And so so basically, you'll get some of this, quite a bit of this message in our presentations. But basically, the culture of abandonment that's associated with assisted death, it can be changed if we care for others. I refer to euthanasia as abandonment because that's what it actually is. It's not about freedom. It's not about choice. It's not about autonomy. It's abandoning people at their time of need. It is essential that people who feel that their life lacks value or purpose or feel that there's no one who cares are offered purpose, support, and genuine hope from their significant community. The answer is to care and be with others as they journey through their difficult times of their life. A recent study from Copenhagen University, it was actually about 2 years ago now, found that women who described themselves as lonely were 3 times more likely to die within the year of a heart attack than those who had an active social life, and men who described themselves as lonely were twice as likely to die within a year. If you actually look at studies, and it's very interesting, Denmark's got some excellent studies because they have a universal healthcare system and they allow it to be used for research. So when you're doing these studies out of Denmark, they're usually very dead on because they're looking at all this data, and it's not about individuals, it's that they have it all coded, right? Patients who are lonely were also 3 times more likely to be anxious, depressed, and they reported a lower quality of life. A survey of 1,896 seniors 65 or older in the UK found that 1 in 5, or 22%, said that they have a conversation with no more than 3 people over the span of an entire week. Now, when we went through the COVID pandemic, I'm sure those numbers were even worse. A quarter of older adults said it makes them feel good when someone smiles or acknowledges them while waiting in line at places like the bank or grocery store. 1 in 5 would be thrilled if someone stopped to ask them how their day had gone. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, now this is from a couple of years ago from the American Association of Retired Persons, but the U.S. Census Bureau said that 12.5 million adults live in a one-person household, which represents 28% of those 65 or older. The National Poll on Healthy Aging reported that 1 in 3 senior citizens say they're lonely. Research that shows that chronic loneliness can impact older adults' memory, physical health, well-being, mental health, and life expectancy, wrote the authors. And more than a third of the seniors in the poll said they felt a lack of companionship. Almost 30% said they socialize with friends, family, or neighbors once a week or less. So that's an American survey done by the American Association of Retired Persons. So when euthanasia was legalized in Canada, many people thought that it would only impact a few people. Well, in 2021, there was 10,064 assisted deaths in Canada in 2021. And actually, that's actually a little bit of an underreporting. And that was up from 7,603 in 2020 and 5,661 in 2019. So in fact, we're seeing a massive growth in the number of assisted deaths. From June 17, 2016 to June 30th, 2022, that's a 6-year period, there were 11,620 reported assisted deaths in Ontario alone. And what is more concerning is this trend is continuing up. Why do people ask for euthanasia made? Well, we're told that people ask for euthanasia because of pain or suffering, but the data suggests that very few people ask for death for these reasons. There are some older people there are some people who are radical autonomous, who are demanding death by lethal drugs. It's my body, my choice, my right. But those are the minority. Those are the very small group. Most people ask for death because they're at a difficult time of their life and they feel lonely, depressed, socially isolated, have lost hope or purpose. Since the change in the law in March of 2021, we've actually seen quite a few more deaths of people with disabilities because they feel they're unable to live in their current condition. And they're not referring to their disability, they're referring to their life condition, meaning that they are dependent on a disability benefit, which does not give them enough money to survive. An Irish study was conducted over a 6-year period that found that a wish to die was most often linked to loneliness and depression. So what this was is that a few years ago, Ireland was debating the legalization of euthanasia, and at that time they rejected it. But a study was conducted looking at this issue of why do people wish to die. The study followed 8,174 people over the age of 50 and found that 3.5% of the people had a wish to die. Those who had a wish to die, 72% were identified as lonely and 60% had significant depressive symptoms. Now we see that also with euthanasia and assisted suicide. We need a culture that cares, not kills. Now, why am I saying that? Most people who ask for euthanasia, they might have a medical condition. Certainly, pretty soon they won't need to have a medical condition. They could go ask for euthanasia for mental illness alone pretty soon. Nonetheless, they might have a medical condition that's significant, but that's not why they're asking for it. For most of them, it's because they're going through depressive symptoms, or they're feeling deeply lonely, or they feel that they have no reason to live. Experience tells us that it's normal for a person who is experiencing serious illness or personal difficulties and loneliness that they will also fear for their future, question their purpose of living, experience existential distress or situational depression, or lose hope. Suffering alone, also, loneliness and isolation and depression, loss of hope or purpose, these are leading reasons why people are asking for death. And all of us experience these feelings. By being with others, you can make a difference in their lives and you can help protect people from euthanasia. So this is the whole basis of the idea. We recognize that people who we know, people who may never otherwise consider the concept of having their life ended by lethal injection, by homicide, that they might now be thinking about it, not because they have changed their philosophy of life, but because they're going through a difficult time in their life and euthanasia is now an option. It's an option that's present to them, and they might be going through a very difficult physical condition, but they're also experiencing significant psychological, emotional, and sometimes existential feelings that tell them that their life, they're telling themselves that their life is not worth living. Compassionate Community Care Charity was created to help people who experience difficult health conditions and to provide a training program for people to visit those who are living with loneliness and social isolation. The Compassionate Community Care Volunteer Training Program will give you the tools to visit and to be with others. So the whole philosophy is we can change the world one person at a time. We can protect people by caring. So by visiting and journeying with and being with others, we affirm a person's purpose for living. We reduce their loneliness and isolation. We help them find a way through their depression and isolation, and we allay their fear of suffering. God created us to be with others. Now, I'm not sure if everyone here on this call is a believer, but if you're not a believer, you have evolved to be with others. That's how you are as a human being. Interconnectedness is essential to the human person. So therefore, we're all affected by the legalization of euthanasia because we're all human. We all experience the similar human emotions and feelings. Cultural loneliness affects our health, it affects our quality of life, and it can be a threat to our life. We are focusing on visiting the lonely and caring for our own, our members, parishioners, people we know in our community around us. It is our goal to replace the culture of death with a culture of care. And there's the information about compassionate community care.
If you've never been lonely, you don't realise what it is like.
It feels as though you've been dumped in the deep end and there's nobody there to rescue you.
Well, you go hours and hours, never speak to anybody.
I don't think you'll ever get used to it. It's always loneliness.
How do you measure loneliness when even trying to talk about it takes your breath away?
The room's just empty.
"91-year-old Margaret Nicholas has lived in this house virtually her whole life, first with her parents, then her husband and family. 2 years ago her husband died. Now it's just her.
We used to do the garden together, do our shopping together, everything was done together.
But you obviously miss him.
I do.
Margaret's granddaughter takes her shopping and neighbours pop in to check she's okay. But it's everyday company she misses.
Some people would think me a bit odd, but I do chatter to my husband. I do it so I'm sort of, speaking.
That's the wife with a cousin.
Roy Croucher lives a short drive away. He and Margaret have loneliness in common. He lost his only son to cancer and then his wife of 50 years.
I'm always hoping that the wife will come through the door, which she never will. If you go out, you come back, and you come back to an empty house, and it's loneliness again. And you're always waiting for somebody to call.
Roy says he's lucky. A friend and her family see him most weeks. But like Margaret, some days the only voice he'll hear is a call from a phone befriending service run by volunteers.
Judy rings up on a Saturday night, because last Saturday she was the first person I spoke to all day.
And that's a long day.
It is a long day.
And how much difference has that made, that phone call that comes on Saturday night when you haven't spoken to anyone else all day?
Well, I always look forward to it. I always put that phone on that seat, ready to pick it up. And that's a great help.
The campaign to end loneliness says it should now be treated as a public health issue. Identifying the most vulnerable is critical, then offering support to cope with the bewildering and painful reality of ending up alone.
I've never been on my own ever before. No.
And so getting used to that has been hard.
It has. I don't think I'll ever get really used to it.
It's just something that is thrown at you, and you can't throw it back to anybody. You've got to just carry on.
Thank you, Alex, for that intro. That's great. And I'm going to segue us into the second part, which is we're going to be talking about why we do this program. It's called Being With, and it's our training for volunteers, which ultimately encourages you. And that's why I'm so excited to be here with you all and to be able to talk to you a little bit about this philosophy. Why do we actually want to visit with others? And why is it so important? And ultimately, what I'll talk about is our human needs, visiting advice, and then Alex will finish off tonight with the My Story Matters. Why does it matter? Okay. So when we're talking about why we actually visit, we see more often, like the video show that you just saw, that there is a strong lack of companionship when we get older for a lot of people. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people. This is a very, very strong phenomenon. Alex, along with EPC and myself with CCC, we have started a survey called Honoring Our Seniors. And this has been a fantastic experience and experiment of sorts, because we are actually gathering responses of seniors, anyone 55 and over, and actually we're slight of our goal by 55 people. So our goal is to hit 500, and we've got 420 something, or roughly 545 roughly answers. So if any of you are seniors and you haven't done our survey yet, we'd love to hear from you. And what we're seeing through that survey, and that's why I'm sharing this, is that a lot of people, the last 2 years, the 2.5 years during COVID, especially, their experience has been very difficult if they had no one as a spouse present in their life. Now, yes, there are the exception. There are a few people who are extremely involved in their communities. There was one, actually, a person who happened to be in civil service and is a politician, and she was very engaged in her community. But apart from that, those few examples and scenarios and exceptions, we see, and in the survey results are coming through, we're seeing a big trend, which is if you didn't have a spouse during the last 2.5 years, or someone in direct communication with you daily from your friends, your community, as in your retirement home or community in life, or a strong presence from your children or one of your children, there was a real lag for a lot of people. So this is something that's been impacting a lot of people. This goal of this project, and especially with the Being With training, which is why you're all so important, is to reduce loneliness and isolation. And so by your going to visit with other people in your community, you're actually providing a solution to this problem. And you're going to be able to watch for signs. We'll share a little bit about that, about self-neglect and possible abuse. And you're going to see that you're going to provide a very strong sense of belonging and value to the people that you meet with, but also to yourself, because you're going to be so integral in the volunteering that you're doing. You're going to see the effect on yourself, but also on the people you visit with. So it's so beautiful. Thank you all for being here. And so we're going to start jumping right in, our human needs. And so when we're speaking about human needs, excuse me, we are speaking on 4 major topics, which are physical, mental, social, and spiritual needs. And so this is looking at the whole person. We don't want to fragment anyone, which is important here. So for example, when the person, for example, physically is unable to perhaps be mobile, that will impact their mental, social, and spiritual sides too, most likely. So we want to always keep that in mind when you're visiting, to encourage all facets of the person, the whole person perspective, a holistic approach, okay? And so physical needs and all these 4 needs are very different for everyone. So I'm going to give us a brief overview of what are some of the main points. And so for those of you who registered for this Being With seminar, you can follow along on the screen, or you can follow along with the book that was sent to you in an electronic digital form. So if you got this in a digital format, which was sent in the attachment, you would see it there. Otherwise, if you want a physical copy, we can actually mail you copies as well after this. So you can review all of this. You don't have to take notes if you don't want to. This will be provided to you as a hard copy or a digital copy if you'd like one, okay? So I'll go over the physical needs first, which are exercise. So for a person who's elderly, especially, this survey that we are doing now has been a very strong point as well. There's a high trend of, or association with, being able to move over through COVID when you are physically mobile, or at least participate in some form of exercise. And this is important for everyone, regardless of COVID or not. Exercise is important. It gets your body moving, your muscles, working, your brain working at the same time. So there's that connection, brain and body and mind. And this is all very important. So for example, people who are older will often need to take some form of medication. Okay. I'd say close to 95% of our seniors that we are interviewing are on some form of medication. Okay, so that's significant. And so when you're visiting with people, especially if they're elderly, you will notice that there are a lot of people who need medication, and they need to think of that when you're visiting with them. Perhaps maybe a reminder would help if it's that important that they take it at certain times, especially, for example, diabetes or high blood pressure. That's a big one. Hydration. Now, hydration levels is very key, because if you don't stay hydrated, and I'm not talking half a cup, okay? My parents generation, they're from that generation where I asked them, do you drink water? They said, yeah, I had a glass today. I said, that's great. Let's try to increase that, and a lot of the time what happens is, excuse me, is that when people take any type of medication, what happens is it creates a difference in terms of what your absorption is like when you are hydrated versus when you're not. So for example, the more water and hydration you have, the better the actual medicines work. If you're dehydrated, you may actually start to feel like you're going to, physical labor, like you're actually working harder to be able to do the same amount of work if you need medications and you're not hydrated. So those are things to keep in mind. In terms of sleep, obviously, sleep is very important, and it affects everybody, affects your mood. So if you guys are, tired right now, then I ask you to give yourself a stretch and move around, because, it's very energizing when you actually just can move yourself. Even if a person can't get up and move, maybe they can actually remove themselves slightly in the physical that they are in. But sleep is going to be a barrier. If you don't get enough sleep and people are up at night, or they're on their phones, or they're on their devices, that's going to impact them. So we definitely want to encourage people to get enough sleep. And you may want to be part of that too when you're conversing with people about their needs. One thing is here that's important is that 90% of people over the age of 65 take at least one drug per week. And like I said, we're hitting numbers of 95 plus with our seniors that we've been interviewing that definitely need medications. When you're talking about mental needs, just like yourselves now, you know, I want to be entertaining, but at the same time, it's very somber and serious, some of the topics we're encountering here. But our brains need to be stimulated, right? So if this is boring, you know, we want to make sure that you're involved. Just like when you're going to sit down in front of someone and you're going to meet with them, we want to be stimulating them. So for example, some people need to maybe have, you know, a game involved when they're meeting with you, or they want to have, you know, a challenge. You know, let's see who can, if they're walkers, hey, let's see who can make it faster to, you know, something, you know, or we can engage them in some form. But we want to have some kind of stimulation. My husband, for example, perfect example, he loves to challenge people all the time on every topic, on a nature or natural, whatever it is. He likes challenge. So I like to, you know, keep up my game with him because it often leads to, you know, this very interesting kind of dynamic, especially with our kids. We have 4 little ones, and you know, he likes to, be rough with them sometimes and joke around. So that way they build up that, you know, that stimulation as well, even if you're indoors. So depression, that's a big issue for a lot of people. And I have to say that at least everyone in our survey, I'd say close to 100% have encountered depression in some form. And that's a serious issue for seniors, especially because as you age, depression really can play a toll on you. It can affect the way you sleep. It can affect the way you eat, the way you are, the way you want to be with other people is completely completely transformed. And so that can also lead to other things. And for example, like this epidemic we're seeing with the numbers of people choosing to kill themselves with MAID, medical assisted dying, over the last, 2.5 years has been so significant because depression sets in and then other factors start to add up. Excuse me. Dementia. Now, dementia, and especially even specific forms like Alzheimer's, affects 1 in 20 people over the age of 65 and 1 in 6 over the age of 80. So these are huge factors for people that we need to realize and keep in mind when we're visiting with them. Another key point here is, for example, how people are affected, for example, when it comes to dementia, people may start to go down that slippery slope and feel like they're a burden for their family or for their friends or just for their community, that they're not being visited. So you're actually providing a solution to this because you're saying, hey, I'm here. I want to see you. I want to speak to you. I want to learn your story. So that's a really big one that we want to make sure that we're fulfilling is their mental needs, but now moving into the social needs as well. When you're talking about social needs, there is a lack of social relationships, and that's a strong factor, and it's a risk factor for early death. And why this is so important is because, as we see, the statistics show that 1 in 5 Canadians aged 65 or older indicated that they feel lonely some or time or often. Okay, now as that age gets older, the proportion is even higher among the older ages. So for example, 85 plus, 25% felt lonely or some of the time. And if you have a loss of a spouse, that just compounds onto that. So there's a lot there that people need to unravel and unpack. Why are they feeling lonely? Is it an existential question? Is it a social issue? Really, that it's in front of you, that you don't have people physically visiting you, you're not communicating with people. Because as the video you saw showed, oftentimes we see that even just that one phone call a week or per day makes a huge difference, which you're of course being part of. A lot of people feel that there has been social isolation, and that's been magnified over the last 2.5 years. So when there's social isolation, there's cutting of programs, cutting of social opportunities. Things like church played a huge role. So for many people, this was one thing that we saw, that church, for example, for those of you who are religious or spiritual, people not being able to attend church was a big factor. Okay, over the last 2.5 years. And when I actually spoke, one of the last surveys I completed this week, the lady was 87 years old. And she said to me, I said, well, did it help that you were able to attend services online? And she said, well, it did something. So her responses were so funny. And she just said, right what it was, the fact, which is, something's better than nothing. And sometimes that's something that you are adding to their life by going out and actually meeting with someone is going to make all the difference. So people do have this fear, and that's of becoming a burden. And sometimes when you feel that, they feel they're reluctant to talk to someone about the meaning of life or life after death. That's why being a friend is so important. Some people want to just get a call. It could be every week, every month. It could be more often, for example, at the beginning, because some people are testing the waters. And so you may want to call maybe once every week, or more often than that. There is a man who we've been speaking to, and he's very lonely because he's in a lot of pain. And so I try to call him every 3 to 4 days at minimum, if not closer or sooner in time. So, but I also don't want to overdo it, right? I don't want to be bothering him. So I often make sure that we check in with him and see how he's doing. And if he wants to speak more, then we speak more. So tiredness, oftentimes you'll hear this. People will quote and say, I'm feeling tired. I'm really tired. And that's really a signal. That actually can be a signal for someone to be telling you that if I'm really tired, maybe I just want to take it easy, or I just feel like I am a burden and I don't want to be a burden anymore. So just take it to depending on the person, you want to read into seeing what that actually means for that person, because they could be physically tired, mentally tired. However, right, socially, they may not want to be active or engaging with you right now. They might want to just sit back and listen or watch something with you. So just keeping those things in mind is very helpful, because each person is different and the way they're going to communicate with you may be very different. And again, that last point, communication, excuse me. Some people want to communicate very often. It's up to you and the person you're speaking to when you're meeting with, that that you're taking upon yourself. When are you able to communicate with them, and how often do they want or wish to be spoken to? And if you need that person, or that person needs someone more often than you can provide, then bring someone in on that. Ask for a support person, like a volunteer that that is also interested in visiting with people or speaking with someone, to come in and actually join you with this other person that you're meeting with, because that's going to make all the difference and will bring more success to that person experiences as well overall. Now, when we're speaking of spiritual needs, this is really, I love this, because spiritual needs are often forgotten, but they are very important. Okay. And so you're very important in your role because, excuse me, spiritual needs involve the relationship with God. And if it's not God per se, but a spiritual being or ultimate power, absolute power, then you're going to help on that delivery in terms of what is that person's needs. Sometimes they're religious needs. Sometimes the person is not religious, but spiritual. So just honoring the person where they are at is really key. Sometimes, excuse me, a person, it might find that they are actually they are using the term spirituality. So when you're speaking to someone, just to make a note of that, because if they prefer to be referred to as spiritual instead of religious, that's something to keep in mind. Okay, that's a special connotation that they're actually trying to translate, so they don't want to be acknowledged as religious per se. So I actually bring into that meaning when we are asking people on their surveys, for example, to distinguish between the two, spiritual and religious. To me, I'm religious, so I honor that. But if they want to respond differently, that's fine. We respect everyone's opportunities to be close to that relationship. When it comes to a need for inner peace, people ultimately just want that peace. And so you are very important in this, because for some people, and I'm going to be fairly serious, because most people, when they get to a certain point in their life, if they have that restlessness, if they have that almost like defiance nature, or this kind of everything is they're a contrarian to everything, there's something that irks inside them that actually is showing that they might not have accepted everything in their life. And then you may want to look further or deeper when you're speaking with them, especially when you have the books. If you need a copy of this one, this is the My Story workbook. You actually can receive this in the mail, and I can mail these to you. So if you need physical copies, these are containing all the questions that you want to ask people, and you have a permission form and all of that. When you go deeper, you can actually make notes in the book for yourself, what to say, and go deeper, because this is the key thing. We spoke with a woman recently who got to a point in place in her life that she had so many layers of unresolved issues in her present life that it was just coming back from her past. And because she couldn't resolve her past, she was just battling through so many things. Like I call them demons, because in a sense, it almost like it was just too much on her. And she needs to reconcile that. And for you, this actually could be an unpacking, unraveling of that background and past. Someone might actually really appreciate, because you are going to bring them closer to their ultimate peace, which is being able to move on in their life. If they are at end of life, for example, then so be that, process. You are part of that. And maybe you need to bring in another person for that. Maybe a priest, a pastor, a caregiver, a spiritual advisor, that can help bring in that closure, because people do need closure, especially at end of life, especially around peace. And then, of course, there is oftentimes we see that some people, may find that they need peace and life satisfaction. And there's two types of, life satisfaction. They might feel that they have intrinsic, which is my life in general, the health, the social, relationships, things like that. And other times there's actually external. Where do I live? What do I do for work? And there's perspective, like the future, the financial security. As I speak to people on the survey side, I find that most people are done when it comes to the external. They're working on the intrinsic. They're learning to be peace with themselves. And it's quite beautiful, because you can see even in age how further along, or some are further not, in their life. So it's actually beautiful. When you're having, for example, all these needs met, there's no issue. Sometimes you'll find across, a person, you'll come across this, that they'll say, oh, they have a need for giving, and they want to give as part of their spiritual needs. They actually want to give back, and they want to donate. So just so you know that, we don't encourage them donating for your services because that will be a conflict, of course, of interest per se. But I would encourage you to say, hey, suggest to them, maybe you want to offer that up to your community where you're, go to church, or, you practice your faith. All right. Excuse me. So now we're actually going to move into the second part of our talk of the 3 parts today, which is visiting advice. So what do we do when we visit? And just going back a quick second, when we're talking about the full person and we're visiting with someone and the physical, mental, social, and spiritual needs, when all of those are met, a person is being brought to peace with themselves. And that's what's really key, importantly. And we need that for many people, especially seniors today. So when we're speaking of visiting advice, I just wanted to touch on this because of COVID. The updates are ultimately very different, and depending on where you are. A show of hands if we're on the east side of Canada. Yes, maybe. Some, no. And otherwise, maybe on the west end. Anyone? Yeah. Okay, or central. Anyone? Okay, well, this is great. Yeah, central. All right, great. Thank you so much. Wherever you are located, the restrictions or lack of are very different and varied across the board. So if you need to use any type of personal protective equipment, PPE, is it sanitizer, face masks, whatnot, then you want to make sure that you have that in place with you for your comfort level and for the person you're meeting and visiting with. If you're going into an institution of sorts, which is like a nursing home or retirement residence or a long-term care facility, you want to honor what they want in terms of what you are wearing or how you have present yourself. Definitely want to assess yourself when you are going into the home or into the place or setting that you're meeting. One thing I want to mention quickly is if you are part of a group and if you are looking to volunteer within that group that you're in already, for example, a women's group or a visiting group or service, then you will probably need or require, excuse me, a police check or a vulnerable sector check, and that might be part of the program. If you need something like that to be fulfilled in order to go and visit just on your own and you want to freelance, I love that. I love our freelancer visitors, okay? So if you just decide you wanted to visit and you're not attached to any group because, for whatever reason, you wanted to just start this initiative, fantastic, great job. We definitely encourage you to do so. And you want to step into that retirement home and definitely want to check in with them, see what their requirements are, and that way you can be fulfilled on that. And if there is something like a visitor police vulnerable sector check or police check and you can't go because you don't want to pay for that or whatever economic reasons, let us know, and we would love to encourage you to go and do it, and we can take care of that for you. Okay, so please definitely don't let anything financially prevent you from visiting. Excuse me. So just want to make sure that you know that. If you are part of a group or you're part of an institution that requires you to wear ID, definitely sport that when you come into the setting and you are making your visits. You want to be recognizable. So if, for example, I went to a group presentation recently with a hospitality group, and it was a lovely community. They are sporting these great vests. They have red vests that they are wearing when they go out and they meet with people in their church. And so that was really lovely to see, because they're noticeable, and it's very nice for people to know who they are and they can trust you. So if you are meeting with someone, do a self-assessment. Definitely, you want to make sure that you are checking if you feel ill. Like right now, I'm just getting over something, excuse me. And so I necessarily would not be visiting anyone because I do not want to get anyone sick. And although it's on the tail end of it and it's done, I still take that extra precaution, you know. So if I were sitting down with you all tonight, I would be very apprehensive about coming close to you. So you want to remain that 6 feet or 2 meters, whatever you feel is comfortable for you. And so, excuse me, definitely encourage yourselves to take that minute to assess yourself. If you feel sick or you're just getting over something, maybe you want to reschedule that visit, and definitely let that person know, calling them and letting them know. It's very good, and they'll probably appreciate that more so than potentially getting something. Definitely washing your hands. So when you enter the place, you actually, it's great and encouraging for them to see you physically go over when you introduce yourself, hello. Before you touch them or you touch anything, just go over and say, hey, do you mind if I wash my hands really quick? This is a great idea. I personally love it as a mom of 4 young kids, 5 and under. I love when people wash their hands, because I just think, you know, you don't know. They've been everywhere. People touch things, right? And it's just nice to know that you have hands that are clean coming into your home. So I love it and I appreciate it, and I think people do too. If you feel uncomfortable for whatever reason, reschedule. If you are visiting and, you know, if you've had the dose of vaccines or whatnot, just to keep that in mind, how that may affect where you're visiting as well, as we're going into the fall months now, and different things are happening. People might be requiring certain things that they want to ask you, for example, if you've had those. So just be aware of that, and that way at least you are prepared. And in terms of the visiting advice, before you go, you can definitely be prepared. So this is a great hand and tool for yourself, that you want to ensure that excuse me, you are prepared. You can bring with you the book, which we have here. They're printed copies, and we can send you more if you like. And this is a great tool because this comes with already in it a permission information first off. So you can actually put in the information of the person you're seeing and meeting with. And then it goes into the appointment times. So where you're going to be meeting, who you're going to be speaking to at what time. So you can actually write that into the book. And then signature, please. It's bright and it's yellow. You want to get their permission. So when the first visit happens, you want to encourage the person and actually say, hey, just so you know, everything that we're sharing today is going to be completely confidential. But as an interviewer, if you're using the book as you are, the My Story book actually comes pre-set and assembled for you. The a permission form, which is a top and a bottom, and they can actually sign here to date it, and then you are the interviewer, you can be put there. And what that does is it ensures that you can share or keep a copy for their use. So you can reproduce it for them, and then at least you're holding it as custody for them until you finish the My Story group or the interview, and then it goes into there from that. Okay, so this is really handy. So I strongly recommend, if you don't have a copy, definitely email us. We'll send you this. We can send it to you, and there's no problem for that. Okay. Excuse me. You could also print it off for yourselves. And so keeping that with you, keeping a notepad, piece of paper, whatever you use, and something hard to write on is really helpful too. And also just keeping something like your phone is handy is good. You don't have to have it on you, but it's great to keep time. And especially if, for example, someone has something they want to check out online, hey, if their communication skills are different, you can actually show them pictures of things and or translate. You know, if they have a language that they speak, you can always translate. It's really beautiful. So some people like to bring things like music. If they practice or they play an instrument, then they can use that as well. So just keeping things like that in mind, preparing all that before you go is really key. When you arrive, if it's in a hospital that has, for example, 2 rooms, or it's a long-term care facility and there's a person that's sharing that accommodation, you definitely want to knock and just say, hello, I'm, Susie from CCC, and I'm very excited to be here to meet with Anna. And that way the other person, whoever is their roommate, knows who you are, because you're entering someone else's space that may be shared. And they would probably really appreciate knowing who you are if they haven't met you before. Excuse me. So you want to introduce yourself, definitely being kind, just attentive and polite. Approaching the person from the front is very important too, because if you come in from behind, you can scare them or startle them. So you want to introduce yourself and just make sure that you address them politely. In certain cultures, you want to say Mr. Mrs. if you find that they might be older than you even, which is very good and nice to know. And then they'll introduce themselves how they want to be called. So that's good too. Oftentimes, if you have or hear that there's a television on or radio, ask if you can turn it off maybe. That way you actually have that opportunity to hear them properly and it doesn't interfere with your visit. And later, remember to turn it back on before you leave. So that's a good tidbit and just a point too. And then if you're sitting in a chair, for example, beside the person, never sit on their bed or put your personal items on their bed, for example, unless they're telling you to do that. Okay, just something to keep in mind, because oftentimes people just plop things everywhere, and we definitely want to be really courteous and very genuine, sincere, that we don't infringe on people's personal space. If a person happens to be hard of hearing, excuse me, sit close so that they can be close enough to hear you without intruding in their personal space. Okay. And obviously being attentive and being sensitive and kind, that's really important. And then of course, when we are speaking, we want to ensure that, we're going to go over all these things too. So I'm just going to jump right into that. We talked a little bit about this. Dressing appropriately, I just want to mention here, is important because if a person, for example, now that it's getting colder and you might be traveling and you're in and out and all of these things, places are really cold. Last night we stayed over at a friend's place and it was super cold. So I wasn't prepared and I wish I had been. So I wish I had brought some sweaters with me. But definitely dressing appropriately for the weather, and especially the places that you're visiting, is really important. And also arranging the visit. So for example, thinking of what you're going to do when you visit and encouraging the person to be creative, because they are sharing their time with you, you're sharing yours with them. You want to be also fun and eventful. If you want to decide to go somewhere or you want to do something special, that's a great idea. Everyone likes that. When you arrive, of course, this is really important. We just talked about that, but hygiene is really important. And of course, introducing yourself, being cheerful. Communication, and I'm just going to pop to this because, excuse me, when we talk, it matters what we say and how we say things. And so I just want to encourage you because, for example, if you are meeting with a person with a disability, you want to introduce the person first in terms of whenever you're speaking. So it's person-centered, person first. So person with a disability or a child with autism, an individual with epilepsy, not an epileptic or not an autistic child, or not a disabled person. Okay. Those are the type of language things you want to keep in mind. Obviously they're common sense, but sometimes we just need reminders of that. And so when we are speaking, obviously we're respecting personal boundaries. So oftentimes we'll see that the same way you want to be treated, you'll want to treat them. Okay. So if you never want people in your face and being up close and kind of getting into your business, obviously you're not going to do that. People have boundaries. Sometimes people really like attentiveness and just being really direct. Other times you'll notice their glance will be off. So just being aware of that is really important. And always ask first. So whatever it is that you want to complete or do, ask if they're interested first. Don't assume. Some people just want to lay back, be low key and not really do much. Other people are super high energy, like an Alex or myself sometimes, when I'm battling with my 4 kids. So yeah, it's just great to see that there's people and that other people are, there's different levels of energy, right? So I often want to keep up with my kids. So but when I'm with my parents, I got to take it easy. You know, my dad, he's 75 and he's barely walking these days. So I want to make sure I keep up with him and make sure I slow down. So it's tough sometimes for some people. And you want to be definitely a good listener. And this is something where the communication is really key. If you can't hear me, I would love for you to tell me so. Similarly, if we're meeting in person, if they can't hear you, I hope you let them know that they can, you can increase your volume as well. It's always nice to have a person who actually increases their volume when you ask them to speak louder. All right. And give them time. So for some people, they're really slow to respond, and they're obviously not going to know you on the first go. But as they get to know you, their responses are going to come faster and more fluid, and they'll see how they can be with you. And so it's very important, I find, to do this, is just to give people a time to actually speak and be with you. And being, of course, alert. If some people use gestures to communicate, so just be alert to that and the type of communication that they prefer, because sometimes people have difficulty expressing their feelings regarding a situation. They may have a truth to share that's difficult to express, so just kind of hold back and wait and be very aware of what their responses are. And of course, talking in a low tone voice is important if they're hard of hearing. Excuse me. And if the patient speaks of a serious concern, inform the staff or family. This is really important, because oftentimes when you're around people, you may not think something serious, but then, oh, I forgot to say that, and I should have, and it could be something that makes a difference in that person's life. So I actually encourage every one of you that if you have a notebook, a separate one from this workbook, to bring it with you, like a little notepad, and then just jot down ideas, because as you meet with them, you might come across something like a tidbit or fact that's really important, and you may want to actually have them note. You might want to note yourself that, oh, in the future, I should remember this, or I should encourage them to talk about that. All right. The next point is nonverbal communication, which is very important. To listen. The way you look, listen, move, react tells the other person whether or not you care, and if you're being truthful, and how while you're listening. So that's actually, great reminder. And facial expressions go a long way. I like to smile, as you see, and excuse me. I think it's important that, sometimes the first thing they see and judge about you is how you smile and how you greet them. And oftentimes that smile will just knock it out of the park. Just to be so warm and inviting, you're encouraging that dialogue. Excuse me. So often the first thing they notice is actually your facial expression. So if you have a sense of fear, sadness, anger, or impatience, that quickly can be revealed. And so that'll affect the message that you're trying to convey. And during a conversation, it's really important. So how you express yourself when you are sitting in front of them will actually be especially important, because how you feel about what they're saying, they'll be able to see that in your face. Okay. Touching, some people like touch. Obviously, some people don't like touch. So maybe you want to just see how they feel. If they want you to hold their hand, for example, you can ask that. You can ask them, do you mind if I hold your hand? Because it might be a very touching moment between the person sharing about their life, and you might notice they might cry. So you can ask them, hey, is it okay if I hold your hand? That might be like the only physical touch they've had in a long time. So just so you know, it's actually really beautiful if that's okay, and if they're okay and you're all right with that. But your voice, excuse me, sorry, excuse me, being sensitive to the feelings behind the words you're speaking. And so, for example, as your voice changes, you'll notice how effect it has on them. And you want to respond to their intonation of their voice as well. Okay, eye contact. All right, I see you. And as you see, I can see you directly into my screen. But if I'm in front of you and I actually see you and your eye contact is showing me you're engaged and you're okay with it, then I will continue to pursue that eye contact. If I see that you're a person who puts their stare down, I will often avoid your eyes just to not make you more comfortable. But obviously each person is different, right? And there's different schools of thought around eye contact. Some are bold, some are not. So whatever you feel comfortable in as well, that's what works. In terms of body movements, the way a person sits, walks, stands, or holds their head is not a strong indicator of feelings as originally believed. Instead, take notice of how they move their hands. Are they fidgety or are they tightly held together? Those are those are indicators as well for you. Or if they're fidgety, if they're doing things like this or picking at things, or are they, tight? That's also a huge indicator. So that's something to keep in mind as well, in terms of their comfort and what's happening in their life. In terms of their appearances, people often will reveal how they feel about themselves, their self-esteem. Are their clothes clean? Is their hair combed? Clothing may reveal their economic status, even perhaps. Culture is an important influencer on this and how appearances are judged. Appearance may also reveal if they're being cared for properly and or by others. So if a person looks maybe a little unkept, that's one thing, but there could be also signs that furthered on, it actually might be signs of actual abuse. So just something to keep in mind, okay? Yeah. And in terms of space, obviously personal boundaries are really important. Be aware of the culture, the social status, different prejudices may come into play here. And the history of a physical abuse might actually be a factor affecting their need for personal space. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And it's very important to be sensitive, not only to the body language, but also to the nonverbal cues of people and your own. All right, so that's very good. In terms of emotions, we're going to just recognizing that a person might be anxious. That could be, they might be discouraged. They might be feeling down that day. You don't know. Don't take their unhappiness personally. So whatever's happening there, don't take it on to yourself. Don't take the load off yourself because it's not your fault. Some people are just, grumpy all the time, right? And I'm sure you know some of those people, right? And you might avoid those people sometimes. Well, those might actually be people that want to talk to you and they're just grumpy because they don't have anybody to talk to. So something to keep in mind. I feel that a lot of time, when a person is angry or complaining, let them voice their frustrations. Like just let it out. Be Teflon so that just loshes over you and bounces off of you. But reflect back to them what they have said so you know that they know you've heard them. So for example, you could say, so you feel that. I understand that you're feeling this way. That's actually going to engage them more and have them understand that you hear them, but you're not going to take it personally, right? Being sensitive to their pain, excuse me, is important here because there's can be lots of pain in the background, physical, emotional, spiritual pain, all that in the background. They might have all that. It's still like, a baggage on them. So that's something that's going to come out in the wash as you meet with them. So being aware of that is important, but also being aware of their current or past illnesses is also important here. For example, a person who has suffered a stroke, they may become emotional very often during your meetings, and that might not be dealing with their emotional sense of, this is who they are as a person. It's just because of the physical manifestation coming through from a stroke event. Definitely being validating of their feelings is important. Even if you don't agree with them, for example, you may want to say, I understand how you may feel. And putting it in those terms will actually ease into that communication style of, we're not visiting people to argue with them, but we want to validate their feelings and where they're at. And we don't want to, be, disingenuous or insensitive, but we want to make sure that they acknowledge that we care for them and we want to be there for them. Right. In terms of conversation. All right. I love when, if people, for example, are speaking and they don't know what they want or they're undecided about a lot of things, making things really simple is really easy and really helpful. So for example, as a conversation, you could say, it is windy outside. It makes me feel this way. That's great. That's short and sweet, so simple. Some people may view questions as being intrusive. So if you keep continuously asking questions, they may actually feel that it's overwhelming. So you may want to take a step back and, excuse me, just focus on some basics like, how do you feel today? What did you do today? How was lunch? Like whatever you want to talk about. When someone has memory issues, be aware of that. Excuse me. For example, dementia, if someone happens to have that, you could ask questions that are simpler even, for example, that only require a yes or no. So would you like to go outside today? And just wait for the response. And if they don't want to, that's great. No problem. We can stay indoors today. And then often you want to make sure you're just asking one question at a time and then moving to the next one once they've obviously answered. If you want them to make a choice, it's very, very easy to say things like, would you like some tea? Pause, wait for the reaction, and then you proceed, right? Would you like a cookie? Again, and that's also something if you find that there's cognition issues or memory or something that might be different that that person might recognize as an issue speaking, you definitely want to encourage them and just ask simple phrases and questions are speaking those there. When someone speaks of their past, encourage them. You know, we definitely want to know their story. This is why we're here. So definitely encouraging a person to talk about them. Their memories actually become clearer to them than the present. And this is really beautiful because there's a quote that says this, that I think it was Aristotle, maybe, that said this, that because older people, oftentimes we're talking, you know, much older, they actually see hope in their past more so than they do in their future. It's because their past is so much longer. They've lived through so many more years. So they don't see the future necessarily maybe as apparent as them as that's the hopeful point. It's been in the past already. So you want to recalibrate that and say, listen, we're hopeful for now. We're here in the now to visit with you and to recover some of those memories from your past. Let me hear those, share those with me. So that way you're pulling on both sides. You know, your hope in the moment is also because it's strengthened in your past, and you're renewing their hope in the present from their memories in the past. Okay. And also just keeping in mind, if you're like me and you have a plan to get through pages 1, 2, and 3, let's say on their first go, you may want to nix those plans if, for example, that person decides they don't want to even talk at all. So just being flexible in your approach is really good. And don't worry if you're jumping around the book or questions or whatever, you know, plans can get changed and the person may just start sharing memories from who knows where, and you don't even know where to put them. So you might just want to bring in a little notepad and then just note those later. So you'll put those in after. Excuse me. Also, everyone has a story. So for example, when you're sharing, you want to make sure that you are encouraging them, always, you know, reminding them of what they're shared with you. That's really beautiful. And for example, sharing memories can make the person feel young and happy, like I mentioned. So recognizing the person for the unique individual they are is really beautiful. And because everyone has a story, they want to share it with you. This is a great point here in one of my last slides. So when you are speaking with someone, obviously everyone here, you're all wise and brilliant, so we won't have to go over this in detail, but you don't want to be impatient. So you don't want to storm through questions and not wait for the answer. You don't want to argue, obviously, especially if you know there's certain trigger points or very kind of what I call spicy topics. You don't maybe want to necessarily avoid those. Yes, I see some nodding heads and shaking heads. Yeah, definitely don't want to argue. That's not why we're here. And you know, you don't want to be dishonest or artificial. You want to ensure that if you are, you know, maybe not in the mood for something, you make that mentioned and you say, okay, yeah, really, I'm not really up for that. It might be cold and it might be getting to the winter now, right? So for some people, they actually feel like they want to stay out more so, but you may not, and they might want to stay indoors. So whatever works. But you definitely want to just be positive and be genuine. That's really important. Also, you don't want to create false hope. So for example, if a person has a medical situation that's not necessarily going to get better, you don't want to give them that false hope either. So, excuse me. You don't want to be judgmental. You want to always keep an open mind. Don't whisper to someone indirectly because you're going to be speaking to someone. And if you happen to be in proximity to someone else, a third party, you definitely always want to keep your attention to the person you're meeting with, okay? No matter what interaction plays out beside you. And definitely don't want to whisper to anyone or any family members or medical personnel in the presence of that person. And definitely you don't want to talk in front of them as if they aren't there. So for example, you know, if someone else comes in the room, you're not going to move away from them and just ignore them. Obviously, these are things that are common sense. So oftentimes too, we don't want to discuss our own troubles because that's something that will bring up your past memories, and we're not there to focus on that. We're there to focus on theirs. So it's actually, essentially, you want to keep it positive and not questioning them about their illness, not forcing them to talk if they don't want to. You want to keep your tone of voice natural. So not keeping it in all these weird kind of crazy things. You want to speak bold but confident and speaking enough so that they can hear you, but you don't want to be too loud. And also don't point out mistakes. I know this is, again, a very important but common sense type of thing that we don't want to, you know, bring out the negative. Excuse me. And then also the gifts. That's another point. You don't have to buy them gifts, and don't accept gifts because oftentimes they think that's tied to bringing in you to the visit. So we don't want to do that, okay? We want to encourage them to just be themselves and have a good time. And when you're ending the visit, you know, we don't want to belabor a bad visit. So sometimes when you have a bad visit, or, you know, they might have a good or bad day. And if it happens to be a bad day, you know, you may want to shorten that visit. You know, just say, like my kids like to say, you know, Susie didn't have a good day today, you know, when their play date doesn't go well. That's what happens, right? So we want to make sure it ends on a well note. And, you know, a doctor visit, a short visit is better than a long visit, right? So adjust the visit accordingly. Prayer requests, it's beautiful to end off a visit in a prayer if they ask for it. So encouraging that is nice as well. And then short welcome visits, like I said, doctor visits, I call them, are great. And definitely plan your next visit. So when you're visiting with them, you want to ensure that they know what days you're available, and you in turn actually are able to then speak to them on those days that they're free. And then thank them. You definitely want to encourage them and be there for them, and make sure that they know that you respect and honor their time. And finally, after the visit, you want to keep a journal. Sorry, excuse me. Yep. And so when you have a journal, I was going to show you my journals. Actually, it's this one here, where you have, you know, a little notepad. This is really easy. You can buy one of these. It's like $4 at the Dollarama or wherever, and you can just have this with you. And this actually is very encouraging because you can keep a quick journal of important things that you learned. And if later you can evaluate yourself, and you can just say a score for yourself and say, hey, this was actually a really great visit. We touched on all the important points. You know, the 4 needs were there. We talked about a lot of great things. And then so-and-so actually disclosed this to me, which I think is important to note for myself for the future. So when you have a next visit, you say, hey, Sally really likes to talk about her kids. That's Jeremy, Margaret, and Nancy. Make sure you know those names so you can encourage them the next time you meet with them and actually bring up those names. And think of opportunities where you can be enriching to that person, be it going out for a walk, taking them for, you know, a quick, you know, walk around wherever they live, seeing or showing them a part of a movie or something that they reminded you of, that you can actually bring like an iPad or on your phone, something, anything. You could bring a tape, you could play a song for them. That would actually be really beautiful and very special, I think, for a lot of people. And then if you have any concerns, feel free to call your supervisor if you have one, or if that may not happen or not be available, you can always call us. We have a phone on our office line that goes directly to me, and also we have a helpline. The helpline is actually an emergency line that's 24/7. Excuse me. So if you come and encounter a situation where you really need some advice or help, immediately call us, call the line. You know, it's free, it's confidential, and you have the access to the person you need to speak to, you know, encourage you and get over whatever it is the issue may be. So definitely take advantage of that. And on this point, I'm going to segue back to Alex. Thank you, Alex. And we'll speak about the My Story. Thanks.
So Kathy's going to control the changing of the slides, and I'm just going to go through the information. So the importance of the My Story program actually connects a lot to the video I showed at the beginning, but it's the whole recognition of the importance of the human person. So the fact is when you do research, you will notice that a lot of research talks about, you know, being with someone is really important, that people, you know, if someone spends a lot of time alone, they're experiencing loneliness that affects their health and everything. But in order to help someone find a purpose to live when they're feeling they've lost that reason, that motive, that purpose to live, is also by asking them about themselves. You know, somebody finds that their life is very important when somebody else actually cares about their life. So the My Story matters because what happens is by asking somebody about them, by asking them to talk about their past, explain their past, what's happening is we're dealing with the basic very issues, and you can go back to the next slide, that's fine, you can go to that. Yeah, we're dealing with the basic issues of depression, generativity, loneliness, self-awareness and self-discovery, self-esteem, social isolation, and trauma. So these are a lot of things that people deal with in their life. So the whole thing about what makes the My Story so practical is the fact that you're not actually then seeking information about them for your purposes, even though, let's say you're part of a group, a church group as an example, and that church group has agreed to do visiting of the seniors from that community. And in that, they're asking them about their story. Well, what they're doing then in 2 ways is they're visiting with people who tend to be alone and lonely. And at the same time, what they're doing is they're gaining a history of their own church community, etc., and they're sharing the importance of that person with that community. We're talking about our past, our history. So we're affirming the person, yet at the same time, we're building our own history, which is very important. Renewing one's life and dealing with one's past has real benefits for someone psychologically, emotionally, because it really makes it important to them. So depression. Well, we've already talked about depression quite a bit. There's a huge number of people in Canada who are elders who are living with depression. We see that in the data. We see that in general, and we already know that affects their health, etc. A 2009 report by Statistics Canada states that men aged 85 to 90 have the highest suicide rate in Canada. Now, that was a 2009 report. I recently wrote an article about the US suicide data because I noticed that in Canada, the highest suicide rate in the more recent data, like 85 to 89 remains, one of the highest suicide rates, men 85 to 89, but it wasn't the highest at this moment. But when I looked at the US suicide rates, men 85 to 89 continue to have the highest suicide rate for all age groups and gender. So this is very important. So when we're looking at the situation, we have to understand that this is a serious health issue for people. Loneliness, being alone is a serious problem. With the legalization of euthanasia, though, this also affects us in another way, because if one's experiencing health problems, etc., sometimes the issue of euthanasia starts seeming very enticing because they're feeling that their life has no meaning, purpose, value, and sometimes they just want an end out of that life. The issue of generativity is important. We all want to be remembered. We all want to believe and know that we had things we did in life were important. And a lot of people, they have a hard time in life acknowledging that or seeing that for themselves. When you're younger and active, it's easy to go on and keep doing things. And, Kathy's got 4 kids, so therefore, obviously, she's going to be kept really busy right now. So she's not thinking about, am I making a big stamp on this world or not? But I mean, when you get older and you might be alone a lot, you start thinking about these things a lot more. So it's important to ask people about their lives. And it's important to recognize that we've all accomplished things. So we're not doing this for the sake of, we're doing it for the sake of helping that person see the importance of their life. The ability to care for others, and also it's important that we recognize that the generations have something to share with the next generation, that generativity. It's a very important part of our need as community. We recognize that community is not as tightly packed as it once was when we were younger. Certainly that's the way I see things, and I'm only 54, and I view how things were when I was a teenager as to how things are today as being very, very, very different. So obviously connecting our stories with the past are very, very important. There's also this thing called reminiscent therapy. Now, we're not psychologists here. We're not trying to be psychologists. We're not trying to be social workers. That's not what we're trying to do at all. We're simply trying to talk to people and be with them. And sometimes the best thing about when you're visiting somebody is that you not talk at all. For some people, they just want to talk. And maybe that's what you're there to do. Just listen, and you come back the week later or 2 weeks later and you spend time with that person, you listen again. But this reminiscent therapy is very, very important for people because it helps them feel that legacy in their life. And it's very, very important that we have this. This whole question of loneliness. Well, loneliness is a psychological state. It's obviously brought on by the fact that, we are lonely, but I mean, what happens, how it affects us psychologically is very, very important to the psyche of the person. So self-perception, is very important, especially for people, because a lot of people who have, how would you say, do not have a lot of significant community, what happens is you stop feeling good about yourself, right? They feel that their life and their meaning is being lost. So older adults who are lonely have an increased risk of dying sooner. They also are more likely to experience decline in their mobility. Well, that sort of makes sense because if you're lonely, you probably aren't getting out as much. Also, compared to those who are not lonely, they have other health conditions. So, there's a video I'm going to show you tomorrow, which will get more into that at the beginning of the session tomorrow, and it will explain all these other health problems that are related to loneliness. Loneliness is strongly connected to depression, and that almost goes without saying, actually. Nonetheless, you see that people who are lonely have very high rates of depression, and when an older person moves to a long-term care facility, often their loneliness increases. That's why, if you read my articles regularly and when I'm talking about loneliness and issues like that, or compassionate community care, we often talk about the importance of helping people stay in their homes. Because even though in, let's say, an institutional model, moving into a retirement home, there might be lots of people living in that retirement home, but in fact, the data shows that we tend to be more lonely there than if we're actually in our home around the surroundings that were normal to us, or that we have our memories connected to. Conversation is a primary way of combating loneliness. Self-awareness and self-discovery. Well, this My Story really focuses on that. So the idea is that the My Story booklet is really good because what it does is it leads us through sort of a way of doing a My Story with somebody. It has a bunch of questions. Now, they may not apply to everybody, obviously, but talking to somebody about their childhood, talking to them about the years when they went to school, about their siblings, about their friends, talking to them about their early work, their marriage, if that's a good thing that they're willing to talk about, possibly other things that they were involved in. If they were involved in a church community, quite a few of these people are historically the people who actually built our churches. They did many great things, and it's important that they have a chance to talk about it. And it's good for us to know that. A lot of us wonder where this community came from, and yet the community came from certain people who did a lot of work for it. Self-esteem. We need self-esteem. People lose perspective on their importance. They question their need to live. It's normal. Like everything I'm talking about these are normal human realities. When we get older, if we're alone, what's going on? I actually should say something here. We just had our Thanksgiving dinner at my house, and there's quite a few because my wife and I have 6 kids, and most of them have a relationship with somebody now. So I've got several married, etc. And my mom is 82, and my dad died years ago, and then my mom remarried, and then her second husband passed away, and then she remarried, and then her third husband passed away. And I shouldn't be smiling, but it really is actually quite difficult to think about the fact that my mom had 3 husbands and they all passed away on her. And lately she's been quite lonely, especially through COVID. She was quite lonely because she's a going concern. She's quite a healthy woman who gets around. She's very, very social, but she's just sort of been feeling lately that even at the age of 82, she wanted to meet a man. So now she has a boyfriend. She brought him with her to our Thanksgiving dinner, and so it's very important for her. But when we're talking about loneliness, my mom was actually going through a lot of loneliness, and you would call her up and talk to her, and she would want to talk, and yet you would think, if you actually know my mom, you realize she's a very active woman. She's a very with it, active, mentally there, physically there woman. At the age of 82, she's still pretty good, no question about it. Yet yes, she was still lonely. So I'm just mentioning that that sometimes for some people, they really do need to have a relationship in their life to feel fulfilled. Anyway, social isolation is very difficult for the human person. We are made to be with others. That's how we are made to be. Okay. So, trauma. Well, a lot of people have experienced trauma. Earlier, when Kathy was talking about faith is very important for many people. And certainly when you're visiting someone who has a strong faith, they might want to share that faith with you. And I think that should be encouraged because that's very important. But when we're talking about trauma, there's lots of people who have gone through different types of trauma, whether that be physical or sexual, or sometimes they had issues related to their faith experience. So it's important that we recognize this with trauma. remember, we're not here to be psychologists or psychiatrists. We're here to try and be friends with someone, to actually talk to them, to deal with their depression by just simply being friendly with them, to ask them about their lives, to show interest in them. And we're doing it not for the sake of ourselves, we're doing it for the sake of others. And we recognize that this is all about their privacy too. So we're maintaining that privacy at all times, and we're only sharing things that only they have said we can share. So we understand all this, but someone might have experienced trauma in their life. And at times, someone might want to actually share that trauma. And I'm not saying that this is a good thing, but for a lot of people, they have to talk about it at certain times of their life in order to deal with it. And hopefully, if someone is actually visiting that person, they can be a listener. We're not here to offer advice. We're not here to say, oh, well, if only you had done this. No, it's not that simple anyway, is it? It's not that simple anyway. Nonetheless, we can be someone who's listening and helping someone by simply being a caring, listening person. My story matters. Well, we recall events, feelings, key topics in one's life. We share memories. This is so important to the average person. Even for yourself, if you're spending more time alone in your life, sometimes it's good to sit down and just start writing down your memories, etc. It's very important. It's a form of healing for the person. Let me tell you, my wife is one who wrote Dr. DeVeber's memoirs with him, right? Dr. DeVeber was the founder of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, a very impressive man. This whole book, the writing of the book, the interviewing him, the editing of the book, going through all of that was actually, as much as if you knew him, you would say, oh, he was an outgoing, kind, sensitive person. But it was actually a form of healing for him. It was actually a good experience for him. It actually did a great thing for both he and his wife. It was an excellent experience for them. It allowed them to have the final years of their life almost totally in love with each other again. I'm not underestimating it either. It was a great experience that happened. Anyway, it improves your cognitive function. Being alone is difficult to one's cognitive functioning. It has an important place in our world because we are sure we're recognizing the importance of that person's life in the world that we live. Okay, it's very practical. It's very simple. It's practical. Reviewing one's life and writing down one's story has many benefits to one's health, whether that be physical, psychological, social, spiritual, etc. We move on. Yeah, it doesn't want to move, does it? Okay, yeah, same thing happened to you now. There it goes. Seniors at a much higher risk of suicide. Yes, depression. Well, I've already gone through that. I think I went through all these separate because I just went through the titles. Yeah, generativity, the ability to care for us, loneliness, self-awareness. Sorry, I went through them all individually. Social isolation and trauma. Yeah, okay. Basic questions. Well, actually, the book actually deals with it, so I don't have to go through that with you, but there are basic questions that we discuss, and the book goes into different things. We can actually, if someone was doing this, let's say a church community, as an example, was celebrating their 100th anniversary or their 75th anniversary or whatever that might be, there could be multiple different anniversaries, and we're looking at these situations. It's possible that we could create a set of questions for those people in that community that would be specific to that community. So when you're doing the My Story, I find the importance of the My Story is it also helps us be visitors. The question always comes, well, who am I going to visit? Obviously, if you're part of a faith community, you can speak to that church and say to them, I want to be involved with visiting. So you get your checks done and everything, and you make sure that we've done what we can. It's also good if you don't know somebody, to go in with two people. That's another thing to remember. Going alone is not a good idea if you don't know the person you're visiting. Once you know somebody, it might be different. Like if you know them very well and you've come to know them very well, then obviously they're more than just someone you're visiting. They become a friend to you. Then visiting them alone might be completely appropriate. But obviously, if you don't know the person, then that's a different story. But the other thing about visiting, what it's doing is, so in your community, they can identify, they could say, well, we know that Mrs. So-and-so, no one seems to visit her anymore. Her children, she had children, but none of them live here anymore. I live in a small community outside of London, Ontario. It's a very small community I live in. And I can just tell you the little story that, there's a lot of older people in our community. And, to tell you the truth, it's obvious why very few of them have children living nearby. It's because there isn't any work in the small community unless you're a farmer and you've inherited the farm from your parents or whatever it is. Buying a farm is nearly impossible. So when I say inheriting, it's probably correct. The fact is that you can't live in that community. There are some jobs, but there's not many. Okay, there are some people who commute. A lot of people live in a small community because it's a little bit cheaper to live there. It's a nicer way of life for many people, so they might live in a small community. But then they're working in the big city, such as my office is in London, right? Obviously, I'm not living in that small community. My wife spends her days in the little community, and I spend my day in London. I think she's got the better side of the bargain, but nonetheless, the fact of it is that it's obvious why this is the case. So when a lot of people are like that, that means there's a lot of loneliness. I don't believe it's a good idea to take people out of their community, though. My philosophical point of view has become very practical after years and years of talking to people. I always advise people not to go into a nursing home unless you absolutely have to. Why do I say that? Why I recognize there's some reasons why someone has to, but I also recognize the importance of being in a community where you belong. And as I say, I tell the story of Mrs. McDonald, who lived across from us when we first moved to the mighty metropolis of Glencoe. So Mrs. McDonald had been a school teacher, and she was now around 90 years old, and she lived across the street from us with her husband. Soon after we moved there, her husband passed away. And so what happened is she was there alone. She was not actually alone in the community because she had two sons who had farms. So they were still in the community. So it's not that kind of extreme situation where Mrs. McDonald was alone all the time. Nonetheless, we were living across the street, and my daughter Genevieve, she was probably about 6 years old at the time. She said, "Oh, can I go over and visit Mrs. McDonald?" And so, we went over there and said to Mrs. McDonald, "Is it okay if Genevieve comes to visit you?" And she says, "Oh, that would be wonderful. I'd love to have Mrs. McDonald just love to have Genevieve come over." So Genevieve would come home from school. This is little girl, and she'd say, "Oh, can I go visit Mrs. McDonald?" Mrs. McDonald was happy with it. Over Jen went and she visited with Mrs. McDonald. And then, a few months passed, and then Thomas, who was 2 years younger, so he'd have been about 4.5 then, he was like, "Can I go over to Mrs. McDonald's?" And we're like, "No, that can't happen. Poor Mrs. McDonald. How could she have, Thomas coming over there? He's a little active little boy." And anyway, so we went over and visited, and Mrs. McDonald was like, "Absolutely, I'd love to have Thomas over." So then we have Genevieve and Thomas going over to visit Mrs. McDonald regularly. Well, Mrs. McDonald, about a year later, so she died. She was in her 90s. She died. That's normal. And so we went to the funeral home with Thomas and Genevieve. And as I say, we're going through the line, greeting the family. And they were all saying, "Oh, so you're Thomas and you're Genevieve." They knew all about Thomas and Genevieve. They knew all, and it's all, our mother talked about them all the time. What's funny about it? You would think, well, what is this woman in her 90s? Why is she okay having my little kids come over? First of all, they liked going over there. And my kids would say, "Oh, we play hide and go seek with Mrs. McDonald." They're like, "Play hide and go seek with Mrs. McDonald?" Okay. They're going, and Mrs. McDonald loved it. And there's never an issue. I don't hear, my Jen is now 22. I don't hear any stories from Genevieve saying, "Oh, Mrs. McDonald." No, Miss Genevieve loved Mrs. McDonald. She just thought it was great. And obviously it was a great experience. Well, what I'm saying to you is Mrs. McDonald had a place in the community. She wasn't in a nursing home. She was in her home. Okay. She was very elderly, no question about it, but she had a place in the community. She had a belonging. She belonged there. She had a reason to live. She had a support system around her. I think that's important. And I think that we should be looking far more at visiting people who are alone in our communities, but we should also be looking a lot more at how we make it possible for people to continue living in their homes. I think of my wife. Now, she's not that old. Like I'm only 54. Come on, she's not that old, but she's always saying, "I'm going to die in my home." And I'm like, well, that's good for her. She said she says, "I'm going to die in my home. I've got everything here I like. I've got my pictures. I've got my house. I've got my things. Everything I want is here. I'm staying here." And I'm like, that's, well, we're young, so I guess it's easy to say, right? We're not sick or anything like that, but nonetheless, it has meaning and purpose and value to have what's around you. And I think that society's been wrong in putting people in institutions. I think it's not the right idea. But nonetheless, our program is not about institutionalization. Our program here is about visiting people, whether they are in an institution or not. There might be some questions. If you have questions, you can either put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask the question. We're going to continue again tomorrow at 7 p.m. and we're going to go through the second half of the training booklet with you. Under chat, it says, from Gloria, my mother is celebrating her 90th birthday and I love to hear her stories. I agree with you. My father lived at home until he passed away at the age of 90 years and 9 months. That's a good age. Absolutely. I don't have, is there another chat message that I'm missing?
No.
No, okay. Does anybody have any questions they want to say, or do they want to have an early evening? If you've got any experience of visiting, we're happy to hear your experiences, just because we're encouraging people to be involved with visiting, and we're trying to provide you with the booklets and information, as well as, some training, as well as, the My Story booklets and things to make it possible to do it. And we're also urging you, if you're involved in some organizations, such as like a Catholic Women's League or a church group of some sort, that you also get them involved in this, because obviously speaking, we have to be brutally honest, our culture around us seems to be aging. There's a lot of people who are much older who could use someone to visit them. It would be very important to them. It might actually also be important for you. You might gain a lot from it. So is there anybody who'd like to ask a question? Just
Gloria?
unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I
Gloria.
came on a bit late because I was out shopping, but I rushed home. I didn't even have a bite to eat. I wanted to hear the training. Shortly after I came to Canada, somebody encouraged me to do volunteer work, which I did, and I enjoyed it immensely. It was with a gentleman who had had a stroke, so he couldn't talk. He could just do some grunting and things like that. But we were able to communicate together. I found a way to communicate with him. I had a notebook and I wrote in the notebook and tell him when I was coming to see him. And if I was late, he had my telephone number and he would call me and I would answer him and tell him, I'm sorry, so-and-so, I'm a bit late, but I'm coming to see you. And if his wife wanted to take him somewhere, he would refuse to go if he knew I was coming there that evening. He would not ever go. And talking about music, one Christmas he was there. Unfortunately, he was alone. And I brought over some Christmas music with me and I played it for him and we laughed together and we had fun together. And we would write a grocery list. I would write the grocery list. I encourage him to go in the fridge and look what is there. And that was part of the training that I got from the group that I was with.
Yeah.
And since then, the family and I got very close together. And since then, they had asked me to do other volunteer work, but what they were offering me, I didn't want it. I would rather do that type of one-on-one thing.
Right.
He wouldn't say he was a senior. He was like in his probably early 50s when he got the stroke.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but
he was certainly needy in that sense. Yes.
I was very fond of him, and we really had lots of fun together. As you talk about stroke and people crying, that happened when I was with him, and I just sat quietly and just let him have his time to do that, and I try to encourage him and so on. And also too, because we were so close, I noticed he had some problems and I brought it up in my report that I made. And I also told his wife too that I noticed that he had certain problems. And then it turned out that I was right and they had to put him in the hospital and then he passed away, sadly.
Yeah.
Well,
it's interesting because you're mentioning about people with disabilities, and a lot of people who are elderly acquire disabilities. So part of the second half tomorrow, we're going to be talking about people with disabilities. Not to say that, we're visiting somebody, not to say you shouldn't visit someone with a disability, because obviously that's important. But I mean, when you're visiting people who you might know or might be part of your community, it's often that they might have had a stroke or they might have had some health issues and they've developed a disability. So these are important things to look at. Because a lot of people, they would say, oh, I know I'm not part of the disability community, even though they have disabilities, but in fact, these are acquired disabilities, right? Over time, many of us get health problems. It's interesting, I'll say, Gloria, we had a couple of training sessions ago, there was a woman from British Columbia who joined us, and you know, she then joined us again. Like I was like, maybe she joined us 6 months ago, and she joined us again then 3 months ago. And the reason is she lives in this big high rise in Vancouver. And she just decided, you're right, there's so many lonely people in my
It's
building.
true.
So she decided what she was going to do is she was going to start talking to people at her building. So she's telling us, she says, oh yeah, in the lobby, there's a nice couch there in the lobby, and people come in and out. And if I notice someone who seems like they have no one who ever talk, I just start talking to them, she says. And this is her ministry in this high-rise building in Vancouver. And she's saying, you know, it makes such a difference because I'm talking to people all the time, and they seem to be much happier because someone actually says, you know, hi, how are you doing? And this kind of thing. And you know, I guess we have to watch what we do sometimes, because sometimes we can seem like a pest in a sense. We don't want to be like that, but you know what I'm getting to. I'm getting to
Yes.
the fact that that there's such a good thing that can be done, and there's different ways to do it. So.
Little quick note here, if you don't mind, for anyone who's interested in participating in our honoring our senior survey, and you happen to be a senior, so we consider senior anyone 55 and over. We are just shy of our goal of 500. So if any of you jump on board with that, we're available to take your responses, and we can do that over the phone too, or via email. So I can email that out to you as well.
So Kathy might not have fully explained it, but the honoring our seniors survey was actually something we applied to the federal government for funding, and the federal government agreed to fund it. They thought it was a good survey to be doing, and it was primarily looking at, of course, seniors and loneliness, but it was also looking at the issues around seniors' loneliness and COVID and what happened. So it's actually, I think that the results of the survey are going to be significant. So I think we can end early because people aren't wanting to talk, which is fine. Maybe tomorrow night you'll have lots of things you want to talk about. If not, we'll give our presentation and then it'll be finished, and hopefully you can be involved in this, and that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks very
wonderful
much,
evening.
Alex and Kathy. Good night.
Thank
Good
you
night.
so much.